Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to our Making the Business Case for Safety Innovation webinar. This is a topic and resource that we are very excited to release and discuss today. So thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Isher, and I'm the Senior Program Manager of the Work to Zero initiative. Before we hop into our conversation, I wanted to talk about today's format and how you all can get engaged. I'll start with an introduction into Work to Zero and how this fits into our safety innovation journey, followed by 35 or so minutes of a deep dive, in-depth look at the science behind our calculators, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. So please engage in the chat, introduce yourself, your name, your company, your interest in technology, share your experiences and how Work to Zero can support you. And also, as we're going through the presentation, feel free to ask us questions in the Q&A tab. So make sure that you're putting those in the Q&A and you're sending those to all attendees and all panelists, not just all panelists, because we want everyone to be able to see the questions. And go ahead and upvote those. So if someone else has asked a question that you're interested in, press upvote so that way it can get higher and we can hopefully get it answered. So if you aren't familiar with Work to Zero, we are a grant-funded initiative at the National Safety Council, and we're focused on helping employers adopt life-saving technology. So really, why send their worker up in the air if we can keep their feet safely on the ground and let the technology take on that risk? We're doing this because digital transformation is here to stay. As we're moving into the next wave of industry and there's an increased focus on safety, we're interested in how we can make innovation more accessible to employers. And when we started Work to Zero, we wanted to know how best to support employers in this journey. And what we found was there really wasn't anything out there yet. So we wanted to have as much support as possible as we could, and then we created the Safety Innovation Journey. So Work to Zero has kind of came out recently with the Safety Innovation Journey. Feel free to check out all of these different steps and resources on our website, nsc.org/work-to-zero. So we really want you to understand your fatality risks, explore technology solutions, determine your readiness, make the business case, and pilot safety technology. So for the first two, understanding your fatality risks and exploring technology solutions, we have resources on the website, reports, webinars, white papers, and we're also going to be coming out with a new risk prioritization tool this summer. As far as determining your readiness, we don't want you just to go out and buy a drone because it's pretty and shiny. We want to make sure that your organization is really ready to adopt these life-saving technologies. And with step 4, making the business case, that's why you're all here today. So we're going to really take a deep dive look into that resource. And then once you've sold your case to leadership, we want you to pilot the safety technology, and we have a roadmap to help you do so. So today we're focusing on making the business case. Once you have a grasp on what your risks are, what the technology solutions you want to look at, and you're ready, we have tools that can help sell innovation to leadership. And as an EHS professional, I know that this is one of the most crucial steps. We know that implementing safety technology for high-risk tasks can lead to lower total medical costs, reduction in claims and fines, and most importantly, a decrease in workplace injuries and fatalities. So we recently released 8 calculators to estimate the return on your investment. And we're also working on a PowerPoint template designed so that you can easily plug in results from the calculator and present to business leaders. We understand that cost could be a barrier in making the business case, and it could be hard for those small to medium-sized companies to innovate. So that's why we partnered with Verdantix to bring you this resource. After today's webinar, where we are digging into the methodology of the calculators, we hope you will visit nsc.org/tech-ROI to take the first step in making the business case. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guests for the day, Sarah Block and Bill Pennington from Verdantix. Sarah is the Manager of Advisory Services at Verdantix. She has specific expertise in emerging technologies and best practices across EHS analytics and sustainability management. Prior to Verdantix, Sarah worked in strategy consulting and research for business, industry, and the public sector. She holds a BSc in politics, philosophy, and economics from the University of Cape Town. Bill is the research director for the EHS practice at Verdantix. He works to identify the key trends and technologies in the EHS space to align Verdantix research to best support tech vendors, and EHS executives to make informed decisions. Before Verdantix, Bill came from a background in corporate EHS, having spent several years as an EHS manager and compliance auditor in logistics and manufacturing industries. And with that, I'll hand it over to you all.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all for being here today. Bear with me one moment. I'll get our screen share up and we will be good to go. Brilliant. So by way of quick introduction, Verdantix is an independent market research and consulting firm that focuses on digital technologies that optimize business processes across 5 key areas: environment, health and safety, ESG and sustainability, operational excellence, smart buildings, and carbon and net zero. We have been covering these markets for over a decade now and really leverage this experience to help our clients succeed with their growth strategies, investment plans, and performance optimization activities. We have had the pleasure of working with the National Safety Council on a range of Work to Zero initiatives. As you all know, Work to Zero focuses on educating an array of employers and safety professionals on the vast benefits associated with technological safety enhancements in the workplace, most notably the reduction of serious injury and fatality, or SIF, events. For this engagement, we supported the NSC in the development of 8 return on investment calculators that can really be used as a tool to support EHS professionals in making the business case for innovation. In terms of agenda for the webinar today, we'll be kicking off by introducing the ROI calculator and the value that they can bring to digital strategy and business case development activities. We will then provide an overview of the 8 EHS technologies identified to support serious injury and fatality event reduction, as well as their maturity. We will then walk through 2 worked examples to see these calculators in action and provide insight into the outputs that you can expect. Finally, as Sarah mentioned, we will close with an open format question and answer session. Workplace fatalities really do continue to represent a major issue for employers. The number of fatal occupational injuries in the US in 2020 totaled 4,764, with a fatality work rate of 3.4 fatalities per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers. Firms are increasingly looking to innovative technologies to help tackle workplace risks that contribute to these events. These can be situational risks, such as struck by or caught between incidents, and systemic risks, such as a lack of training and fatigue, for example. With a surge of innovation in the EHS technology sector over the past decade, there is now a vast range of solutions available to safety professionals. But how do firms go about identifying if technological enhancement is a good fit for their business? And furthermore, which technology out of all of the options available will bring the greatest value to their safety initiatives? As firms navigate towards technological adoption, there are multiple stages that need to be completed before business-wide implementation. At the very start of this journey, firms need to determine their business goals and review how different technologies can fit into or support these strategic imperatives and initiatives. Firms should seek to collect and analyze incident and near-miss data to really help them hone in on the appropriate interventions that will tackle their highest risks and material hazards. With the increasing adoption of EHS technologies, there are more and more proof points in the market that firms can leverage to understand the applicability and potential impact of these tools in their operating context. Once technological enhancement is identified as one of the desired approaches to reduce accidents in the workplace, management of change is reviewed. Firms need to consider how tech adoption will impact incumbent operational activities and assess the digital readiness of the business's infrastructure. This infrastructure review is not only looking at physical infrastructure and its ability to support digital tools, but it should also consider readiness from a people and process perspective. Critically analyzing these factors helps identify what operational components need to be adapted to facilitate the successful deployment of the technology. The third step, why we're here today, developing the business case and financial implications of tech adoption, is arguably one of the most critical stages of this journey and can be the go, no-go determining factor for these initiatives. Management will typically be grappling with prioritizing different projects and assigning budgets based on potential impact and ROI, or return on investment. During this stage, ROI calculators are valuable tools that can help firms build the business case and communicate the profitability of the investment, comparing costs to how much can be earned or saved from implementation. The final components of the technology adoption roadmap involve piloting the tech to measure the real-time impact these solutions have on operations, and developing the implementation strategy that will guide and support the scaling of this technology across the business. So we have seen where these calculators fit into the tech investment and implementation process, in that they support the business case development. However, these tools can bring a range of other benefits to firms going through the digitization journey. ROI calculators ensure transparency into the financial implications of a project by helping firms understand if the investment will yield a positive net return and estimate the expected break-even point. These tools take a holistic approach to quantifying the estimated business benefits to the firm by creating a comparison between the costs associated with business as usual and the costs associated with the tech adoption scenario. This methodology and direct comparison of these scenarios helps provide insight and quantify both the operational efficiency gains, as well as the mitigation of incidents that, under business as usual, would result in injury costs, such as medical fees, property damage, and worker compensation payouts, etc. Having insight into these estimated costs and potential savings across these categories gives firms the ability to compare the impact of the project relative to other potential projects, which really helps management prioritize initiatives and delegate budget. Finally, ROI calculators are inherently flexible tools, specifically the ones that we designed in this initiative. They have the ability to model different scenarios, so firms can forecast the relative impact of the investment by the scale of implementation, which of course can support in refining the implementation roadmap. So ROI calculators are essentially made up of three main components: inputs, the model mechanics themselves, and the outputs. The input values are dictated by the tool user. It is here where you have the ability to add in business-specific information that tailors the model output to your specific operating context, such as your industry and number of employees. These inputs will influence the model outputs. So take industry, for example. Greater impact is found across high and very high risk industries, such as construction, manufacturing, and mining. Due to the higher incident rates in these industries, you can expect to see a stronger ROI, as the costs of investment are outweighed by the savings in incident mitigation and avoidance. Some calculator-specific inputs are also required, such as number of vehicles or machinery for proximity monitoring sensors, for example, and information on whether you operate a night shift, which contributes to higher level of incidents. By tweaking some of these input values, such as number of vehicles or employees to be equipped with the technologies, users can model different scenarios relating to scale of deployment, really to help determine the most effective implementation approach. These inputs feed into the model mechanics. a diverse list of assumptions are incorporated within the model mechanics to ensure actionable insights. These assumptions are driven from case studies of tech adoption across different industries at different scales, and by leveraging reputable data sources, including BLS, OSHA, and NSC statistics. Furthermore, all assumptions included in the calculators have been validated through a mix of vendor and expert interviews. These assumptions range from annual software adoption costs to per employee industry average of workers' compensation, injury and fatality costs, and incident rates, which are tailored to that technology and that use case. So for example, assumptions on cost components such as injury costs are calculated to only incorporate incidents to which the technology is directly aimed at mitigating, ensuring that the comparison between business as usual and tech adoption can occur. The calculators use validated assumptions regarding the expected percentage reduction in incident rate due to the investment of technology. The ROI calculators use these inputs and assumptions to generate the model output, which includes the estimated dollar return per dollar invested, break-even point, and 5-year expected cash flows. This data can then be leveraged to develop the formal business case for the project. The NSC identified 8 technologies that focus on reducing workplace incidents for at least one of the top 18 non-roadway hazardous workplace situations. These 18 hazards range from confined space entry and work from height to machinery operation and construction or installation. These technologies reduce workplace hazards through risk mitigation, which involves decreasing the risk profile of the activity, to risk eradication, which involves removing the need for human intervention during certain high-risk activities. ROI calculators have been developed for the following 8 high-impact EHS technologies, which I will introduce before I hand over to Bill to cover a few worked examples, honing in on 2 of these technologies. So up first, we have autonomous mobile robots, which are sensor-enabled robots that can understand and move through an environment without being overseen directly by an operator or on a fixed predetermined path. We have scoped this calculator to material handling use cases as they decrease ergonomic risks and reduce material handling related injuries. AMRs bring supplementary benefits of improved efficiency and productivity of material handling activities. Second is permit to work software, which manages the digital workflow and content that enable operations and safety managers to apply an approval process that manages risks relating to hazardous work activities and speeds up the process of signing off jobs. Permit to work software decreases risk on site through the verification of credentials and competencies of its workers. It also improves risk management, hazard mitigation, and operational visibility. Number 3, in-cab fatigue monitoring, refers to in-vehicle camera-based driver monitoring systems that detect fatigued and distracted driving and alert drivers and supervisors to these real-time risks. These 2 technologies help reduce fatigue-related worksite vehicle incidents and the associated property and vehicle damage costs. At number 4, we've got fatigue monitoring wearables, which are wearable vital sign monitors that track bodily metrics in real time to measure worker fatigue. These tools improve fatigue management and as a result, reduce related absenteeism, presenteeism, and healthcare costs. At number 5, we've got proximity monitoring wearables. These are fixed and wearable sensors that detect the location of nearby objects without physical contact and alert to impending collisions and warn employees of hazardous situations. These sensors help reduce transportation or contact-related incidents between employees and machinery or equipment, and decrease property and infrastructure damage and replacement costs. 6 looks at virtual reality for digital training. VR tech serves many use cases, but is particularly valuable for digital training in the workplace. VR devices immerse the user in an environment that is entirely computer generated, but allows the individual to navigate the environment as if physically there. VR safety training allows workers to gain experience in realistic and immersive simulate environments. This has been shown to increase training retention, impact, and engagement. VR training can also be leveraged to provide safe training environments for high-risk work. 7 looks at lone worker wearables, which include wearable hazard sensors that detect hazardous conditions such as gases, particulates, and extreme temperatures, as well as wearable vital sign monitors that provide real-time insights into lone worker well-being. These solutions help improve lone worker monitoring, emergency response times, critical event management, and bolster communications. Finally, number 8, unmanned aerial vehicles, commonly known as drones, are aircraft managed by a ground-based controller that can be leveraged for a range of industrial use cases, such as surveying and inspections. For this ROI calculator, we have scoped it to the confined space inspection use case. This technology supports risk eradication and mitigation by decreasing the demand for worker-led confined space inspections. UAVs also increase efficiency and improve the quality and accuracy of the inspections themselves. We have used the Verdantix tech roadmap methodology to help visually demonstrate the maturity of the 8 technologies identified. This methodology analyzes the maturity, business value, and pace of innovation of each of the technologies. While all 8 technologies have been categorized as high value based on research, expert opinion, and real-life case studies that demonstrate and quantify the impact, they are all at slightly different stages of maturity, with AMRs, in-cab fatigue monitoring, and fatigue monitoring wearables in the launch phase, which means that they have launched commercially and are actively demonstrating tangible business value. The remaining technologies are all in the growth phase with high proven value, where they have been able to generate benefits that are sufficient for the ecosystem to grow rapidly. Now that we have gone over the business value and of the ROI calculators and provided insight into the 8 technologies that we've included in this initiative, I'll hand over to my colleague Bill to provide a few worked examples.
Thanks, Sarah, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Verdantix has worked with the NSC and the Work to Zero program since its inception, and personally, I think Verdantix and personally for myself, I really see the merits of a program like this. Coming from a corporate EHS background, one of the hardest things was to be able to sell implementing any sort of technology or kind of any sort of solution to help support my workers, to my bosses and to their bosses. I think, those of us who have been in the field or are currently in the field, I hope that there's a lot of you on this call today who will get some value from this. One of the hardest things is EHS has typically been seen as a cost center, and it's very difficult sometimes to dispel that notion, as well to really highlight the value of implementing a technology that might have a capital investment without being able to show some sort of operational gain or operational profits, which you might realize by implementing a technology or process. So I think these are really great tools, and they're really useful tools to dispel that notion and hopefully move us towards a future where this technology can enable zero fatalities and eventually down towards, zero incidents and accidents. On the next slide here, Sarah had mentioned that, the next half of this webinar is going to be looking at some of these worked examples. So Sarah laid a very great foundation on what is an ROI calculator and why are we looking at ROI calculators for EHS technology and why we're here today. And I wanted to spend a couple minutes here going through two examples that we put together, which can help demonstrate the value. Again, there are now 8 of these calculators on the NSC's Work to Zero website. For the tech ROI calculators, you can go through, you can play with all of them. You can look at each of those different technologies, but we just wanted to show kind of what they look like in practice, some of the outcomes, and then also how did we develop those? What are the driver trees for those? One more thing that's kind of important for me to note is that Sarah did mention that we were looking at these technologies from specific use cases. Now, these aren't all the use cases of these technologies. Each of these technologies can have a range of different use cases. We looked at those which we thought were the most impactful, those that you were able to quantify a little bit easier to support you in your journey. But it's important to note there's a lot of different use cases for a lot of these technologies, and they might look a little bit different depending on your organization. So it's something to kind of consider while you're looking at a technology to implement to reduce your fatalities, to reduce your incidents. Another thing of note is, these are generalized ROI calculators. We do the best that we possibly can to provide a general overview of, the costs and the benefits associated with each of these technologies, which Sarah says that we, gained through our own internal research, validations with vendors, with corporate end users of these tools. But your situation might be slightly different. There's a lot of factors that come into play with the adoption of any technology, your organizational size, your appetite for risk, your specific processes, any legacy technology or infrastructure you might be using. All of these can come into play, which can change your values a little bit, what your current injury rate already is, things like this. So we wanted to provide a good framework for you, but also keep in mind, there might be some things that you can tweak on your side once you get these kind of outputs and you understand how they're driven, that you can kind of adjust to ensure that it's getting the most accurate picture of your situation. So the first two slides here will be around these things called driver trees. So you might be familiar with the driver tree is. This one is on proximity wearables, so I'll go through it. I'm not going to talk about one for the fatigue monitoring wearables. I figured showing one would be kind of all we would need to go through it. And it's going to just give you an idea of, how do we develop the inputs and what do the actual drivers look for each of these calculators. So in a couple slides, you will see what the input page looks like. But through our research, we recognize that, for most of these technologies, they're going to have unique inputs, but many of them are going to be specifically around things like your industry, because industry is going to have higher rates of potential fatalities or injury rates, depending on what area we're looking at, as well as typically the number of users or number of vehicles that you're going to be having on site to better understand what the capital investment of these technologies would be. Numbers of employees, and in a couple of these cases, actually for both of these cases, we're looking at night shifts because it's been, well proven now that workers who work through night shifts or work in night shifts typically have a higher potential for risky behavior or higher potential of incidents, either due, from a variety of different factors, fatigue potentially being one of the most common of those factors, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And, again, too, since we are talking about, just to go back a little bit, we are talking about this proximity, as you can see with the first, input or, driver tree assumption there. And it's important to note that, there's a reason why we looked at these different technologies. Sarah mentioned that we went through BLS data. We highlighted from previous NSC Work to Zero projects what the riskiest behaviors are, most hazardous situations that led to the highest amount of fatalities. And when we think about proximity wearables, the reason why we're talking about this today is because struck by and injuries, caught between injuries are two of the OSHA fatal fours. So if you're familiar kind of with the OSHA fatal fours, being struck by something or caught in between something, typically machinery, but also vehicles are two of the four most leading causes of workplace fatalities. The way this typically happens, especially with a vehicle, I worked in warehousing for a time, is, people aren't aware of where a vehicle might be on the warehouse floor. It also could be more of a cluttered or something like where there are racks of materials and you're unable to see around blank corners or in tight corners. Also in loud environments, potentially like a warehouse, you might not hear the alarms. You might not hear the backing up horns on these forklifts or these industrial vehicles, and workers can be struck and killed by those. Or potentially an operator error where they assume that an area is clear and an area is safe, and it is not, because they're not able to see kind of that clear line of sight. So we recognize this is a high risk situation, and we wanted to look at a technology, and one of the best technologies for this is proximity monitoring wearables. And that's why we developed a calculator for that today. So when we look at the driver tree, we looked at it in two different ways. So the first way is a business as usual scenario. In this case, we looked at what does a scenario look like if there is no technology adoption at all, if you're just doing it like a normal day, and what are the costs that typically would be associated with an incident or an accident in that type of a scenario. So it's three key areas. We looked at those injury costs. So, there's the straightforward injury costs. So if someone gets hurt, you're going to potentially have to pay for the medical costs. You might have to pay for fines, depending on if you receive some sort of OSHA fine based on the situation. There's also the workers' compensation, which, you will either have to pay out workers' compensation, or insurance premium costs can increase depending on your incident rate, or your overall incident rate, as well as, something that's maybe not as easily to quantify, but your lost time costs. So if a worker is injured, typically you're going to lose days off of work, and you're going to ultimately lose productivity because of that. We also looked at fatality costs. This is something we don't want to think about. It's very, very unfortunate, but every fatality does have a cost associated with it. You're typically losing, I hate to think of it in this way, but you're going to lose productivity, you're going to lose wages, you're going to lose a worker essentially who would be able to work, if the situation didn't occur, as well as you're going to incur administrative costs associated with this, as well as, we'll include the medical costs associated in there, as well as fines. Very commonly, if there's any sort of preventable situation, a fine can be accrued if there's a fatality. And then finally, when we are talking about vehicles in this case, we do look at things like property damage. So you're going to have your vehicle damage from your industrial vehicles. You're going to potentially have property damage from the surrounding area, and having to then have some sort of infrastructure repair on your warehouse or whatever building you might be in. So this was the business as usual scenario. So next, we also looked at a separate one, which was if they actually, if you as a firm adopted proximity monitoring wearables. So leveraging a technology is going to have these capital costs. It's going to have these operational costs, but it's also going to have these operational benefits, as well as the benefits that you don't see on here is the reduction of these fatality and injury costs associated. So in a technology adoption model, we will have these initial capital costs, which can be hardware. In many cases, these proximity monitoring wearables will be some sort of wearable device that's on a worker, as well as potentially an associated beacon that goes onto the vehicles themselves. There'll also usually be a software or associated software that works alongside this hardware for alerting or monitoring of workers, for management, potentially, leveraging for analytics and risk identification for best, implementation of safe practices. You'll also have your running costs. So if you are going to leverage any sort of a software, typically you need some sort of subscription fee. That could either be by a per head basis or an organizational overall enterprise cost. And with that, there will also be things like maintenance of your software platform or your devices, and training. So training is always going to be a key piece of it. As Sarah mentioned, there is a change management piece to it. So the training of best use and best practices of using these types of equipment. But one of the benefits that you'll see here that are highlighting, outside of obviously the reduction in injury costs, is operational efficiency gain. So when you do have these reduced injuries and fatality costs, you are going to gain some sort of an operational efficiency gain, as well as not having the need for operational shutdowns, slowdowns, and costs associated with things like reduced vehicle and property damages. So this was the two different types of scenarios that we looked at for each of the driver trees for each of the 8 technologies. They might look a little bit different, but all the same kind of concept. On the next page here, you will then see what it looks like if you went to the National Safety Council's tech calculator website and you inputted the proximity monitoring wearables for the technology, and then filled out what potentially might look like your organization. So for this one specific example, we looked at a small warehouse or small storage type of situation logistics firm. We looked at leveraging proximity monitoring wearables for 25 vehicles as well as 100 workers, but also a warehouse that would potentially have a night shift. And then you get to choose your industry as well. And I think this is important to note because, as Sarah had mentioned earlier, some industries typically going to have a higher amount of proximity strike incidents. This might not be as relevant if you are a medium risk retail firm, or maybe you are in utilities where you're not going to be using industrial powered vehicles in close proximity very often. But in cases like warehousing, this is very, very relevant. Speaking from experience, but also the fact that some industries, like if we consider manufacturing, where there's a lot of different either forklifts or machinery in motion, manufacturing has think about 8 to 10% of the workforce, but they actually accrue about 15 to 20% of all incidents, and I think around 8 or 9% of all fatalities. So very high risk. A lot of this is due to proximity to machinery as well as industrial vehicles. So important for you to recognize high risk industry. As well as then you have the opportunity just to see how many employees overall are within your organization. So if you input all of these into this calculator and you go onto the next slide here, you will see what does the actual cost savings look like. So Sarah mentioned we try to look at it over a 5-year gap, because typically within the first year or so, depending on technology, you're not going to see a massive ROI. So in this scenario, every dollar that you invest, you'll have a 50-cent return on investment over a 5-year period. You'll actually see an ROI in 3 years. In this case, year 1 obviously had a large capital investment. It's not fully recouped during year 2, but by year 3, you actually see, an overall savings of about $500, and then you continue to grow. And now, again, this is a relatively small organization. Expectations are, when you think of economy of scale, as you get larger, very high chance that you will see larger types of returns on investment for these type of technologies. So moving on, it also provides a bit of an insight when we think about what could have been. So if we look at what the cost of business as usual would have been over those same 5 years without leveraging any of those technologies, the proximity monitoring technologies, you can see that costs would have potentially accrued around $230,000 over 5 years. A large portion of this being through medical costs and fines, workers' compensation associated with those medical costs and fines, and higher insurance premiums, and then wage loss and administrative costs for each of these. On the next slide, we will then take a look at what is the investment that you're going to have to be putting into these technologies. So, as we had mentioned, there is a initial cost for all technologies. Some of them are higher, some of them are lower. And there's an operational cost. Again, some of them are higher, some of them are lower in the technologies that we look at, depending on, what type of solution is it. So things like, AMRs that we mentioned have a very high initial costs because you're implementing these automated, mobile robots. And operational costs might be a little bit higher, but then potential savings could be even greater as you're removing risk entirely with that situation. So that was the overall summary of the capital investment and operational OpEx costs. And then moving on, we're going to move on to the in-cab fatigue monitoring. So once I get to the end here, I'm going to pause and talk a little bit about some of the things that we didn't see within this calculator that I think are super important to keep in mind. But I'll move through the in-cab fatigue monitoring calculator next. And, similar to the last one, we have this input page. And, fatigue is a really interesting concept. We've all felt fatigue. Fatigue doesn't always result in some sort of an injury or an accident or fatality, but it increases the chances pretty drastically. As Sarah had mentioned before, I think there's been a bit of a mindset shift in the way we look at risk over the past 5 years, 5 to 10 years. Typically when we looked at risk, it was very focused on things like hard risk. So machinery is faulty, there's some sort of maintenance error, something crashes into something, there's clutter on the ground for slip, trips, and falls. But we've really started to recognize that there's a lot of soft risks that are involved in any incident or accident. And then incident or accidents typically have a wide range of causal factors. These soft risks can be things like competency, as Sarah mentioned, overall worker wellness, and one of them being fatigue. So NSC has done a lot of work looking into fatigue, and the reason why is, it's a risky situation. The NSC had even found that around almost 50% of workers are just sleep deprived, and that's all workers. And then it increases even more when you look at those who work night shifts, potentially regular and long shifts. Not 62% of night shift workers actually, complain about sleep loss. And fatigued worker productivity, and this is just productivity costs, can cost employers up to $1,200 to $3,000 per employee annually. So this isn't even really taking into account the potential injuries or accidents. And we look at some of the worst disasters that we've had in the past 25 years or 30 years. The Texas City BP oil refinery explosion, the 2009 Colgan air crash. A lot of these actually, when they looked back at the risks, was around fatigue. So fatigue actually played a serious role in these, as well as now we're looking at in-cab fatigue monitoring. We've seen that, workers who are behind the wheel and are fatigued have a much higher chance of injury or an accident with a much lower reduced reaction time. So we wanted to look at this. We also are looking at the fatigue monitoring wearables for those who are potentially in warehouses or within a job site, but this one's specifically on, vehicle transportation, especially on site. So similar, I won't spend too much time on this. We looked at, night shift plays a key role in it, specifically how many vehicles are going to have these in-cab fatigue monitoring systems, which typically will view things like micro sleeps, or someone who's not paying attention to the road, and then also again the industries, obviously transportation plays a key role, and how many employees that you have. So on the next slide you will see what the overall cost savings are, and this one's going to look a lot higher. So if we can move on to the next slide here. So, this one seems a lot higher, and I think it's important to note that, these types of costs or these incidents typically have a much higher price tag on them. You're looking at the vehicle costs, you're looking at the worker costs, you're looking at the higher prevalency of fatality for these type of incidents. So there's a higher cost associated with it. So you'll see a return on investment within year 2. Over 5 years, you could potentially see a savings of almost $3 million. With year one seeing a pretty high capital investment, and then continuing to see this return on investment over the next 4 years. On to the next slide here. If you're operating at business as usual, you had no sort of means of reducing fatalities through fatigue monitoring. You could see business as usual costs reaching around 5.5 million over 5 years. Again, very high associated costs around medical fines and the associated workers' compensations, as well as the administrative costs and wage lossing from these vehicles being out of service and productivity loss. On the next slide, capital investment is much higher. Operating costs much higher, again, depending on the size and scope of your organization. I think if we lowered the amount of vehicles or increased the amount of vehicles, you see this change, obviously, but each of these technology implementations has an associated hardware that needs to be maintained and associated software that needs to be maintained. So the initial costs are going to be much higher, but the benefits are pretty stark. So almost $1 million to invest for your CapEx and your OpEx, annual costs of around 700,000 as well. Again, these can fluctuate depending on your situation, but fairly high investment, but important to invest to notice these benefits that you'll see in the previous slide. And on the last slide here, also just highlighting, the costs associated with as the investments for the technology. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say a couple things around, these calculators are incredibly valuable. And on the next slide here, it's always about incidents and accidents. We always want to ensure that our workers are healthy and safe. It's not the easiest to sell that to any of your your shareholders, your stakeholders who make these decisions for investments. But some of the things that you can't really quantify and some of the intangibles that we don't have in these calculators pull a lot of weight. And I think it's really, really important to recognize this. So we see amazing cost savings for some of these technologies in just an operational gain. But it's also important to remember now, if we think about the ESG and kind of this big frenzy towards ESG, everyone wants to understand, how they can become a leader in the ESG and the social, in the social kind of leader space. And ESG at the moment is, pretty focused on things like net zero pledges and energy transition and carbon neutrality, yes. But there's the S part of ESG. So there's that social piece. And if you think about some of the other, standards and frameworks, which, framework has become the key framework yet, but maybe you think of SASB. One of SASB's, SASB's concept is around human capital management. And one of these is around the health and safety of your worker. So we're going to eventually get to the point, we're already starting to see it today, when brands that have low incidence rates are safe places for workers, demonstrate the value and drive an investment towards protecting their workers, are going to have a brand advantage. You don't want to be the next firm that's on the news because a car crashed into somebody on the road or crashed into somebody on the work site because they were fatigued and there was several fatalities. It's a brand damaging. And demonstrating that you care about your workers and you care about their safety is a brand advantage and can lead to a competitive advantage against your peers. Not easy to quantify, but I think that you can kind of go off of the growth that we're seeing in the ESG space to kind of make this kind of discussion with your shareholders of why we need to focus on safety. Another thing is the better quality of employment for workers. We all know that there's the Great Resignation happening in the US, at least. People don't want to work at an organization where they don't feel appreciated, they don't feel supported, and safety is a big piece of that. You never want a worker to be scared to come into work. You never want a worker to feel uncomfortable at work because they don't feel safe. And when you input these type of things to support them, I know things might also seem, with data privacy, can, something to be considering. Having this clear communication with your workers about why this is valuable, why you want to protect them with these technologies, they'll feel like they have a better quality of employment and most likely will stick around keeping that knowledge, keeping that skill in-house, as well as an improved relationship with your suppliers and partners. Again, similar to the brand perception piece, if you are able to demonstrate, a safe working place, a clear investment and vision on safe workplaces, you're going to ultimately, be more of a symbol or a paragon within your industry. You'll be able to ensure that you have, better relationship with your suppliers, your contractors that are beyond site, your partners, and with, the public in general. So, a couple of these areas, I mean, not easy to quantify, right? But just as important, if not more important, at the end of the day. Look at your peers, those of you who have successfully implemented these technologies, speak to them, see if there's ways that they can maybe send you or, provide you with these ROIs that they've actually seen in POCs or in technology implementations. Tech safety and shouldn't be siloed. Striving to work to zero shouldn't be a single organization's goal. It should be all organizations' goal. Everyone should be striving that there's never fatality again in the workplace. And we need to work together for that. And technology is a great place to start. So with that, I will pass it back over to Sarah to lead us in any Q&A that we might have gotten. And please ask any questions if you have any.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah and Bill, and I couldn't agree more. We did have a question just come in a few minutes ago about anticipating updating the calculators in the next few years. I know that we originally looked at it over 5 years and did put in a cost for inflation, but what do you all think about updating them or continuing to add to the research there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I would agree that I don't think any of these calculators can be static. I think inflation is going to be something that we have accounted for, probably not to the extent that we expected inflation to reach in the past couple months, but has been accounted for. Also, another point to mention, and I think this is really good, I didn't really get to talk about it, but is a lot of this technology, we looked at the roadmap. We saw that, there is pace of innovation for some of these technologies, but a lot of these technologies do innovate fairly quickly. You'll find new use cases for some of these technologies. So it's something that we'll definitely keep in mind, be able to update, maybe with better kind of, with the usage of these calculators throughout the industry, we can have some more conversations, can get a bit more granular on them as well. With these open dialogues with the end users of these calculators, and again, keeping up to date with some of these innovations, because this might have looked different 24 months ago before COVID as it looks now. And if any sort of situation happens like that again, we might have to slightly adjust them.
Right. And with that, are there any technologies in the pipeline that you all are excited about from a safety perspective?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I get very excited about a lot of different technologies. Obviously, the 8 that we highlighted here today are very, very important. I think most of these are just in their infancy of really being able to be used to their full extent. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of organizations out there who aren't leveraging a lot of different technologies outside of maybe just software platforms. So very excited for that. Another one that I am interested in is computer vision as you consider camera analytics. Really exciting, really interesting what the type of value that those technologies will provide for firms. And I think one underlying factor of that is it's not just the computer vision itself that's really exciting, it's AI and machine learning. So AI and machine learning is really giving us a unique opportunity of how we can apply it to safety. Will we start getting to the point where we can predict accidents and incidents and predict fatalities, identify where the risk is before it happens, so kind of a real-time risk management, and maybe even become prescriptive where these technologies can tell us the steps to take to prevent these accidents. So super exciting. I think we're in a really, really exciting point of time for managing health and safety, and can't wait for the next few years.
Yep. And we had a question come in that, for an employer who wants to sell innovation, where should they get started? And I think you talked about risk, and we need to understand the risks and understand your hazardous situations, and then look at these upcoming technology solutions that can solve for them. to kind of look at that full safety innovation journey. But is there anything else that either Sarah, you or Bill can think of that would be a good starting place for employers or small businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, what I had mentioned slightly there at the end is look to those leaders in the space, especially if you're smaller, who have accomplished some of these. The National Safety Council has a really wide and diverse space of great organizations. Many of them are leaders in the space. Look towards the type of technologies they've adopted. Look at case studies, use cases. Join some of those industry groups. Talk to them, see what has worked out, what hasn't worked out, because some technology, isn't at the place yet where it's relevant or going to be impactful for everybody, unfortunately. So, speak to them, look to that, develop your own technology roadmap, leverage these types of webinars, that information from your peers to identify, some of maybe baby steps, easy technologies, or expanding on technology you might already have. And then build out a tech roadmap for, shoot to the moon, by the end, see what the most exciting technology you can consider is, but try to take these kind of, piece steps up that ladder, and be a little bit easier to sell, as well as if you can leverage things like ROI calculator, hopefully you can make that case a little bit easier.
Right. It doesn't have to be an overwhelming journey. We're here to help. There's lots of other EHS professionals out there that step by step we can get there, And with that, I really just want to thank, both of you for joining us today. I have a couple slides just to wrap up. Sorry about that. It's not progressing. Some of our resources available that we talked about, if you enjoyed this webinar, we have a lot of other webinars on our website. We also have a new website coming, kind of a relaunch of our website and resources at the end of the summer. So check us out again. Also, like Bill had mentioned, we have these upcoming priority technologies that we're really excited about. So we have a webinar series and a white paper series coming out for camera analytics, EHS software and mobile apps, artificial intelligence and data, and robotics over the next year. And you might ask, how do I get involved with Work to Zero, or how do I see what NSC is up to? So save the date. We hope to see you at NSC Congress and Expo in San Diego at the end of September. Work to Zero will have a safety technology pavilion and technical sessions. And then next year in February, we have our Work to Zero Summit and Expo in Long Beach, California. So I just want to thank you all for being here. If you have any questions or would like to become a partner with Work to Zero, feel free to reach out to us or check out our website at nsc.org/work-to-zero. So with that, thank you all for joining us.